He wasn't someone who ever hogged the spotlight, probably to a flaw.
I think he'll be remembered as an immensely creative man who was not in love with his own face or his own stardom or his own ego.
He's like my son, he's like my younger brother, my friend, my disciple, all combined together.
The world will never let go that he's Beatle George. I mean, there's no way to get rid of that.
He was one of the four most beloved, most adulated faces that the world has ever seen, and perhaps ever will see again.
In 1943, Liverpool, England was a bleak place. The port city was left scarred by the bombs of the German Blitzkrieg of 1940, and the economy reflected the austerity of a country at war. It was here, among the seafaring population, that George Harrison was born on February 25, 1943. George was the youngest of Harold and Louise Harrison's 4 children.
Harrison came from very ordinary parents, although it was at a time when you could be poor and you could be happy. They weren't people who went after state benefit and that sort of thing. The family had good jobs, they were a stable family.
Though times were hard, George's father found steady work as a bus driver. And thanks to his former job as a ship steward on an ocean liner, he had access to something that would change his youngest son's life.
Liverpool had this strange position of being a seaport where the transatlantic ocean liners docked, and the stewards on those liners and the crew brought back these import records that nobody else had heard in the country, really in the country. So a lot of boys in Liverpool picked up on this American blues music.
George loved the Depression-era train songs of musician Jimmie Rodgers. But by the time he entered the Liverpool Institute, the next generation of ship stewards had discovered something even more exciting. It was called rock and roll.
It was like a dispatch from a distant land where, you know, there was excitement and energy at a time when Britain was still recovering from the pounding it had received during World War II.
School, of course, took a back seat to rock and roll, and George was soon spending more time learning guitar chords than anything else.
He didn't really have much to do with school activities, and he in fact did very poorly at school, to the extent where he was in very much of a danger of being sort of kept down a year.
Although they may have been disappointed by their son's poor academic performance, his parents did not object to his new passion.
His mother in particular was a rather jolly and eccentric woman who encouraged him to be a little bit different. Now, being a little bit different in the late 50s, the middle to late 50s, was that you played the guitar and you liked rock and roll.
George liked being different. That was apparent from his slicked hair and skin-tight pants. But he was not satisfied to just look the part. He wanted to master the role.
It wasn't easy for him to learn the guitar. He wasn't a natural musician. He would practice till his fingers bled.
He learnt to play the bits on the records, the American records, that other boys didn't know. Therefore, he seemed like a virtuoso because he could play a Chuck Berry solo.
George Harrison clearly heard the Carl Perkins stuff. He clearly heard R&B stuff, and just found sort of the roots of his own style, which would basically define rock and roll guitar.
George was practicing music with an older schoolmate named Paul McCartney. And before long, Paul introduced George to his friend John Lennon. Paul and John had a band called the Quarrymen, and George wanted in.
John was very much the leader of the Quarrymen, and I think that he regarded George as very much a sort of kid hanging around all the time. Although, in fact, George was a much better guitarist than either John or Paul then.
He could play a bass guitar instrumental number known as Raunchy. It was an American song. When they got on the bus to go home, John used to say, "Oh, go on, George, play us Raunchy." And George would pick out the bass notes and they'd say, "Great."
Lennon was amused and impressed by George's performances on the bus and asked him to join the band. He jumped at the chance. The group performed wherever they could, and under less than ideal conditions. The band added a bass player named Stuart Sutcliffe, renamed themselves the Silver Beatles, and began playing regularly in local clubs. It wasn't long before they were offered their first tour outside the UK. And now, calling themselves the Beatles, they made their way to the bohemian club scene in Hamburg. It was unlike anything 17-year-old George had ever seen or even imagined.
He was in the centre of the red light district amongst all the sort of pimps and prostitutes and strippers and sort of all the local sort of Al Capones, and it was rather a sort of eye-stretching sort of experience for somebody so young.
I'm pretty sure that he lost his virginity in Hamburg, probably several times, and certainly got, certainly got his first initiations into drugs, serious drinking, and possibly venereal disease.
The group's music reflected their new lifestyle.
They were very loud, they wore leather, they played at grotesquely exaggerated tempo, and they spent most of their marathon shows blitzed out of their head on amphetamines.
The band lasted 7 months in Hamburg until local authorities learned that George was only 17 and had him deported.
Because we were playing in a red light district, everybody had to have an ID card. And at midnight, anybody under the age of 18 had to leave the whole area. And there was on stage, you know, smashed out of his brains because he couldn't handle alcohol, was George Harrison, playing till 5 or 6 o'clock in the morning.
George was deeply disappointed by the turn of events, but in fact, he was returning to Liverpool a changed man.
I think that he actually sort of absorbed years and years of maturity within a few months as a result of that. And I think that, if anything, Hamburg, rather than the Liverpool Institute, was his true education.
In the winter of 1960, the Beatles returned from Hamburg to Liverpool. To some, they looked like a completely different band.
They just changed beyond recognition. The first time I saw them, I couldn't believe what I was seeing. It was absolutely fantastic. The sound just went right through my body. I gave him 12 bookings that first night. George never said a word, just looked at me because he was younger than them and he was very shy, and even when he first joined the group, they sort of would hardly let him speak.
The group soon took up residence at a dingy backstreet jazz club.
They began to play at the Cavern Club, which was an underground club in the centre of Liverpool, which had been a cheese, or underneath a cheese warehouse. This place stank of mouldy cheese rind and was incredibly hot and squalid.
Despite the questionable venue, Harrison took his music very seriously. He was, as always, anxious to learn more.
First met George, of course, when we first played with the Beatles down here. And my biggest memory of the first meeting George is all he wanted to talk about is my guitar and his guitar and what licks I'd learned.
He was a perfectionist, George. And I think if his guitar playing hadn't have improved, he might well have packed down.
The Beatles' reputation spread, and in the fall of 1961, they came to the attention of a local record store owner named Brian Epstein. He went to a lunchtime concert to see what all the fuss was about.
And he thought the band were great. And he decided that he was going to make it a project to manage the Beatles and get them signed to a major record company in the UK.
Brian Epstein did become their manager. Epstein had the boys clean up their act, trading leather outfits for mohair suits and polishing their performances. He also encouraged them to write more of their own songs.
He said, you're never going to be known for doing covers. You're only going to be known for doing your own material.
Epstein soon arranged a meeting between the Beatles and record producer George Martin, who signed them up. there was a change almost immediately. In August of 1962, the band ousted drummer Pete Best and replaced him with Ringo Starr. In October, the boys released their first single, Love Me Do. It became a top 20 hit, but their first album, Please Please Me, became a phenomenon, topping the UK charts 4 months later.
After that, it was plain sailing. They caught on. They had gimmick haircuts, gimmick accents, you know, you name it. But I mean, the main strength they had was the fact they had a very strong songwriting team in John and Paul.
Nearly overnight, the band became a huge sensation in England, and they began a non-stop series of nationwide concert, radio, and TV appearances.
Happy Christmas, all the best.
And the Beatle uproar quickly went global.
There are rumors around that this is Britain's revenge for the Boston Tea Party. 3,000 screaming teenagers are at New York's Kennedy Airport to greet, you guessed it, the Beatles. This rock and roll group has taken over as the kingpins of musical appreciation among the younger element.
On February 7th, 1964, the Fab Four arrived in the United States for an appearance on The Ed Sullivan Show.
What none of them could have been prepared for was the absolute scale of the reception which awaited them. Absolutely nothing, even faintly like this, had ever happened to anybody from their background. First of all, there had been no big rock and roll stars from Britain in terms of the American audience. And secondly, no working class kids from Liverpool had ever been subjected to the kind of barrage of fame and adulation which now greeted George and the rest of the Beatles.
The first of the Beatles just arriving.
It must have been the strangest possible experience, and I think it brought them, all of them, a lot closer together.
Did you hope to get a haircut at all?
No. I had one yesterday.
Their now legendary performances on The Ed Sullivan Show only served to ratchet up the frenzy both in the U.S. and all over the world. Beatlemania, replete with fan clubs, posters, copycat clothing, and haircuts, even dolls, was now gripping the world. Lennon and McCartney received the lion's share of attention from media and fans. They were regarded as fun-loving and outgoing. George Harrison was seen as reserved and retiring.
I mean, it's partly to do with the fact that he didn't smile much, and that's why he tended to sort of be regarded as rather a sort of, if you like, almost sullen character. I mean, although whenever he smiled on stage, because it was such a rare event, all the girls would scream. That was his big moment. Well, that, and when him and Paul used to sort of bear in on the mic together and go, ooh, during Twist and Shout. I think that he also looked kind of poetic in a way. He had what you'd call suffering cheekbones, I think.
You never sensed in him that it was about, he loved that spotlight. And you hear that in his playing. Even on record, he wasn't someone who ever hogged the spotlight, probably to a flaw.
My first feelings about George was that he was maybe a bit snobbish, but which came as we got to know each other was totally so far removed from the truth. George was such a lovely guy, and he thought about things.
Lennon and McCartney were writing most of the Beatles songs, but Harrison did contribute a few. For their second album, he wrote his first recorded song, Don't Bother Me. It might have been a harbinger of what lay ahead. And even though he was the best guitarist in the group and now playing lead, George still felt second class next to Lennon and McCartney.
I think he was kind of halfway up the hierarchy, if you like. He was somewhere in between the road crew and the high command of John and Paul, Brian Epstein and the producer, George Martin. He was regarded as very much a tool for Lennon and McCartney's masterworks.
Harrison's confidence was further undermined by their record producer, George Martin.
He would never scream and shout or be abusive, but in little ways he made Harrison feel sort of inferior. He would tell him exactly what solo to play on his guitar. He would spell out the notes on the piano and say, play those notes on your guitar.
Harrison got his revenge of sorts in the spring of 1964 when the Beatles began shooting their first feature film, A Hard Day's Night. One scene in particular is very revealing about George.
He runs into a bunch of pretentious youth TV producers and presenters who don't recognise him and treat him as with the contempt that they reserved for real teenagers. And you see him quietly and sardonically and sarcastically absolutely taking them apart.
She's a trendsetter. It's her profession. She's a drag, a well-known drag. We turn the sound down on her and say rude things. Get him out of here. Have I said something amiss? Get him out.
George was depicted as the quiet one in whom there is more than meets the eye. And I think that's an astute bit of characterization.
It was on the set of A Hard Day's Night that George met Pattie Boyd, a model-turned-actress who had a bit part in the film. A romance quickly blossomed.
I think he initially came on as a sort of rough, untamed Liverpudlian, but she perceived a sensitivity beneath that, and I think that was what was attractive.
In January 1966, Pattie and George were married, with Paul and Brian Epstein sharing Best Man honors.
Well, actually, I asked Pattie out when we were making the film, and she said no, which was very embarrassing at the time, but it all worked out right in the end.
While the Beatles were shooting their next movie, Help, a spoof on Beatlemania, an incident on the beach where they were filming provided Harrison with another important introduction, one that would forever change George and the group.
They're filming on the beach, one of those wacky Beatles scenes in the sea, and an Indian in a turban rides along the beach. He stops and he hands George Harrison a book. It's a book on Indian religion, and he just rides off. And George looks at the book and he's hooked.
In the summer of 1966, George Harrison was just 23 years old and already a seasoned performer.
She said she loves you, and you know that can't be bad.
The Beatles were about to launch their third cross-country tour of America, but Beatlemania was taking a darker turn.
Don't forget, the Beatle boycott is still in effect. We have not forgotten what the Beatles said.
America was outraged. John Lennon had said that the Beatles were bigger than Jesus, and the band found themselves apologizing.
You know, I just said what I said, and it was wrong, or was taken wrong, and now it's all this.
The context it was meant was the fact that Christianity is declining, and everybody knows about that.
The fans forgave the Fab Four and flocked to their shows. But by now, Beatles concerts had become so frenzied that the band couldn't hear themselves playing over the crowds. George Harrison was a perfectionist who'd always taken his guitar playing seriously, and it especially frustrated him. At the end of the tour, the band announced that it would be their last.
John looked at me and he said, "Oh, that's it, no more touring." And a voice on the other side of the dressing room said, "I'm no longer a Beatle." Guess who? Dear George. What he was saying seemed to be, to me, a weight lifted from his shoulders that he doesn't have to go on the road again.
George was perhaps the main advocate of the Beatles packing up. Beatles concerts have become more like tribal gatherings, and they were just sort of playing into this wall of screaming.
The Beatles retreated from the concert stage and behind the walls of their Abbey Road studio. There, they set out to redefine the role of rock stars. They produced ambitious records that critics called art, records that climbed straight to the top of the charts. In 1966, the album Rubber Soul revealed a new, more lyrically mature Beatles. And on the song Norwegian Wood, George Harrison introduced fans to an Indian instrument called the sitar. At the time, he was looking to break out of his role as the baby of the band.
He was beginning to feel like, you know, an adult musician with stuff to say.
Harrison had written songs before, but it said Lennon and McCartney generally limited him to 2 per album.
He had to struggle to get his songs accepted. And at one point he actually went to John with them before presenting them to the group in the hope that John would be able to kind of improve upon them, or at least give it some sort of executive clearance.
The Beatles were changing pop culture and revolutionizing pop music. Now Harrison was emerging as a songwriter. In 1966, Revolver opened with his song Taxman, a response to the high taxes that the Beatles faced in the UK. But meanwhile, their internal power struggles were just beginning to divide the band, especially Harrison and his schoolboy chum, Paul McCartney.
I think he regarded Paul as some sort of insurmountable barrier to sort of deeper intimacy with John, who was somebody that he much admired. Sometimes he'd be very upset, the others amused indifference to him.
George Harrison was confronted with more than indifference when an old Liverpool friend visited the Beatles in 1967. Tony Crane found Harrison sitting idle while Lennon and McCartney were composing.
He said, I'm getting fed up with this. He pulled me to one side. He said, every time they write a song, he said, Paul now wants to play lead guitar on it, and John wants to play lead. He said, no, they're asking me to play one note. He said, it's absolutely crazy. He said, but I'll just do it. Keep them quiet. Anything for a peaceful life.
A peaceful life was something Harrison craved more than the others. In fact, he'd always rejected celebrity. Now, it seemed he was searching for something much bigger. And for a while, it looked like LSD was the answer.
Sometimes it can lead you on to sort of untold levels of creativity, or else it can be the beginning of a spiritual journey. And I think that that was what happened to George.
LSD turned Harrison and the others onto psychedelic culture. And the result was the dazzling 1967 album, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. The record reflected the times. The Haight-Ashbury hippie scene was exploding, and mind-altering drugs were everywhere. But for George Harrison, it also reawakened an interest in spirituality and Indian music. He began studying sitar with Ravi Shankar.
He came to me in such a down-to-earth manner and asked me questions about music, and I was really very, very touched by his approach. It was, I would say, love at first sight.
George Harrison's new taste in Eastern music put the Beatles back in the musical vanguard. He was leading the Beatles, and it was a new experience.
For the first time, here was a little trend within the Beatles that George was setting. It wasn't simply that he was, you know, a kid tagging along with the ideas and interests of the big boys. He was leading them.
It was kind of mind-blowing at the time he did it, you know. I mean, we're just a few years after Buddy Holly, and here's a guy bringing Ravi Shankar, his sound, into the biggest band that ever was.
Now, Lennon and McCartney, the leaders of the biggest band that ever was, were for the first time giving Harrison more say.
It was the strongest creative period for George Harrison because he had just discovered Indian religion, and the Beatles wanted the sound of Indian music on their records. They wanted that sound. The Rolling Stones were doing it, you know, they wanted to do it, and they wanted to do it better. So that gave George power in the studio.
And in February 1968, George and his wife Patty once again led the rest of the Beatles, this time on a pilgrimage to Rishikesh, India. There they studied transcendental meditation under the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi. they were joined by other celebrities, Mia Farrow, Donovan, Mike Love of the Beach Boys, all looking for inner peace.
It's just mystical beyond belief, and it's beautiful too, because you have the huge river coming and flowing onto the plains. We were above the banks of the Ganges, a few hundred feet up, looking out, and it was just an idyllic, mystical, spiritual, beautiful place.
And it was a place of creative freedom for all the Beatles. Rishikesh inspired the songs of the White Album.
One typical day, Paul McCartney came down to the breakfast table with his acoustic guitar, playing a song that he had just written. He said, "Listen to this, Mike," and flew in from Miami Beach, BOAC. He was writing back in the USSR, and I said, "Hey, Paul, you ought to talk about all the girls around Russia in the bridge," and which he did.
McCartney and Lennon weren't the only ones writing great music. In this spiritual place, George Harrison composed songs that were anything but spiritual.
George started to write songs which were witty and rather naughty in a sort of Lennon way, emotional in a McCartney way. So While My Guitar Softly Weeps has this kind of McCartney sort of heart on your sleeve kind of passion.
But as George Harrison focused on himself, his marriage to Patty began showing the strain. The relationships between the Beatles began to founder too. Harrison and McCartney bickered with each other during a recording session for the film Let It Be.
All of George's resentment spilled out, and he said, "You've never given me time on Beatles albums, you've never given me enough time." He accused Paul McCartney of always trying to teach him how to play the guitar.
During that same film, the Beatles gave an impromptu concert on the rooftop of Apple headquarters. What the crowds didn't know was the band was reaching its breaking point. It would be the last Beatles concert ever. But the band patched things together long enough to record Abbey Road in 1969, their last and some say greatest album.
When they did the Abbey Road album, George came into his own then and shone like mad on that album. Some of the best guitar playing he ever did is on that album.
You know, the last few Beatles records, he was just hitting them out of the park. I mean, While My Guitar Gently Weeps, Here Comes the Sun, Something. I mean, every one of them a modern standard.
Harrison was finding his voice and already branching out on his own. He'd released a solo production, the soundtrack Wonderwall, in 1968. And John Lennon had all but left the band for his new love, Yoko Ono. Then, in April 1970, a frustrated Paul McCartney announced he was quitting. It was really over, a bitter end to a brilliant 7-year run for the world's greatest rock band. And George Harrison was on his own, at last.
The breakup of the Beatles liberated George Harrison. It freed him to build his own house and to be master within it.
Right after the Beatles broke up, George Harrison released his first album, All Things Must Pass, in 1970. It was critically acclaimed and revealed him to be a strong solo artist. George Harrison finally on his own.
With All Things Must Pass, the floodgates opened, you know, and all these songs that hadn't found their way into the Beatles' oeuvre suddenly had a place to go, and what a place. I mean, that record is so deep.
His spirituality shone through in his writing. Songs like My Sweet Lord, What Is Life, and The Art of Dying. He was exploring new topics, and he was asking big questions.
I mean, the guy wrote a song called What Is Life? You know, I mean, that's a big topic to take on in a pop song. I think he had bigger things on his mind than a hit record. I think he wanted to, you know, change the world.
And in 1971, he tried. When his mentor, Ravi Shankar, agonized about the crisis in his native Bangladesh, Harrison organized the Concert for Bangladesh. It was the first major rock benefit in history.
He saw my anguish and, you know, my sorrow, but when he heard about my plan and the feeling that I was going through, he said, "Ravi, I'll help you." And that's how it started.
He called me and said that his friend Ravi Shankar had called him. They were having this terrible famine over in Bangladesh, and he had this idea of doing this benefit concert and asking his friends to play in it.
Nothing like it had ever been done before. Tens of thousands of people crammed into Madison Square Garden to see some of the biggest rock stars of the time. George Harrison, Ringo Starr, Eric Clapton, Bob Dylan, and Leon Russell.
It was one of the most exciting things that I have, witnessed. He wrote a song, Bangladesh, Bangladesh, and overnight the name of Bangladesh was everywhere.
People had high hopes back in those days, and there's the old fable of the Pied Piper. Music definitely has a power built in.
She really was the first guy to step forward and say, maybe we can use this rock culture that we've created for some good. And I think a defining moment in terms of rock growing up and realizing it could be more about, a cute haircut.
He was also in a new role, frontman, even though his friends say performing live made him anxious.
While he told me that he was nervous about being on the stage and being the coordinator of the event and so forth, when he got up on the stage, he seemed like he had been doing it all of his life, like he might have played with the Beatles or something.
But while hitting new peaks creatively, there was a surprise setback when he was sued in 1975 for copyright infringement.
A particular body blow to his creativity was when he was sued over My Sweet Lord bearing too much of a resemblance to He's So Fine by the Chiffons, and he lost a lot of confidence as a songwriter.
He was accused of subconscious plagiarism and even played his guitar in the courtroom to convince the judge otherwise. But years later, he paid a large sum to resolve the case. The real cost was much higher. Critics say that much of his work after that was more hesitant.
I mean, I can sympathise with him in a way because, there's only sort of 12 notes in the chromatic scale, and surely sort of every combination of them has been used up.
If he retreated at all, it was deeper into his spirituality. He was becoming more and more serious in his study of Indian philosophy and religion. Some argue he was too focused, at least for his wife, Patty.
But I think that he got far too involved in that for her particular liking. And also, I think that at that time Eric Clapton, who was George's best friend, was kind of sniffing round her.
Rumors flew about Patty and Eric. After Patty and George divorced in 1977, she married Eric Clapton.
I think only George Harrison, Eric Clapton, and Patty really understand that relationship. But for the rest of us who weren't part of that relationship, we got some great music out of it. Patty inspired great work out of George, and there's this other record called Leyenda, you might have heard of, that it also came from that relationship.
Clapton said he wrote it as a love song to Patty. The two men remained close friends in spite of it all. Within a year, George met Olivia Arias of A&M Records, who became his companion. They had a son, Danny, in 1978, and were married shortly after.
She was very into spirituality and religion, and consequently she was a very sort of obvious partner for him.
His wife Olivia is very, very strong and very, very protective of him, and was the person that he needed, a kind of sheltering person.
By now, the world knew George Harrison as the intense spiritual ex-Beatle. But he was not the serious introvert that the public thought him to be.
George is never serious. He really is funny almost all the time. He is a series of paradoxes. He's the quiet one who never shuts up. He's the, I, me, mine, who is totally generous and gives to everybody. And he is the spiritual one who is hilarious.
George Harrison and Eric Idle had been fans of each other for years and finally met in 1975 at a screening.
He'd been very moved by a Python sketch which I wrote about a police officer planting marijuana on a pop star. And as this had happened to him, he felt I was really addressing him personally, which I guess in a way I was.
They became fast friends, and when Monty Python lost financing for The Life of Brian, Harrison stepped in.
The original sponsor had pulled out because of its, they were concerned about whether God could take a joke.
He mortgaged his house, and with his manager, he founded this company called Handmade Films, and they made it. And he paid for it all, and it was the most anybody ever paid because he wanted to see a movie.
For he's a jolly good fellow.
Idol starred in the film.
For he's a jolly good fellow. And so say all of us. And so say all of... You bastards!
Harrison loved filmmaking and relished time on the set.
I was there one day and I was sort of waiting and waiting to do my bit, and I said I could complain to him about how awful it was to wait. He said, wait till you have to wait till Lennon and McCartney are finished with the studio.
Life of Brian led to other projects for George Harrison, even involvement in Idol's mockumentary, All You Need Is Cash, starring the Ruttles.
The Ruttles are the prefab four, as we all know, the Dirk, Nasty, Stig and Barry, the legendary mop tops, whose legend will last a lunchtime.
In the film, Idol even parodied Harrison's time in India. George played a reporter.
Eric Manchester, the Ruttles press agent, are these allegations true?
No, they're conjecture, you know. They're sort of rumor.
But even while he continued to produce, he stayed far from the press.
Whenever he finds those telephoto lenses pointing at him, it brings back all sorts of things that he doesn't want to think about and deal with again, which is why he intensely wants to be left alone.
And he always had the sense he was maybe the one who most realized that you can lose some of your soul in being too public.
And then, on December 8, 1980, John Lennon was assassinated outside of his New York City apartment building. George Harrison was stunned, and after the tragic death of his old bandmate, he retreated even further into his own world. After the murder of John Lennon in 1980, the already very private George Harrison retreated even further into himself. Throughout the 1980s, his musical career was essentially on hold, but it was obvious to those who knew him that he couldn't get music off his mind.
Each time we did bump into George through those years where he wasn't working, the first thing he said was, are you still doing shows? Are you still playing everywhere? Wow, what type of gigs are you doing? It was like as if he wanted to, but it was an awful lot for him to get a band together to actually do the shows.
Harrison did come out with a successful solo album in 1987 called Cloud 9. But to the world, he would always be a Beatle. When the band was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 1988, Harrison was there, flanked by John Lennon's sons, Julian and Sean. He needled his former bandmate, Paul McCartney.
It is unfortunate Paul's not here because he was the one who had the speech in his pocket.
Later that year, Harrison began working on another solo record. In the process, by sheer accident, he ended up in a new band with Bob Dylan, Tom Petty, Roy Orbison, and Jeff Lynne. They called themselves the Traveling Wilburys.
The Wilburys is an interesting story because I believe the story went that when he had Cloud 9 out, he had to do a B-side for like a European single. I mean, a real afterthought. And that, sort of hanging out with his buddies in L.A. turned into the Wilburys.
Originally, it was just sort of 5 friends sort of messing about over a sort of summer's afternoon. But then it was decided that the result, Handle with Care, which they sort of wrote together, was too good to hide on a B-side of a single.
But the union wouldn't last. Just 6 weeks after the release of the Traveling Wilburys' first record, Roy Orbison died at the age of 52. Then tragedy would strike even closer to home. In July 1997, Harrison was gardening outside his home near London when he noticed a lump in his neck. It turned out to be throat cancer.
he was diagnosed with cancer a few years ago, which seemed to be the legacy of having been a dedicated cigarette smoker for years and years and years.
He had the lump removed a month later and was given a clean bill of health by the time he made a rare public appearance in June 1998. It was at a memorial service for Linda McCartney, who'd recently lost her own battle with cancer. Then, just as the world prepared to ring in the new millennium, a bizarre incident at his home in England.
British police have confirmed that former Beatle George Harrison and his wife Olivia
Beatle George Harrison in the hospital after an intruder stabbed him in his home outside
Harrison
London.
was stabbed, we are told, several times in the chest, and his wife Olivia.
His wife came to his aid like a whirling dervish and attacked the burglar with a lamp and really saved his life. He thought he was going to die. Olivia saved his life.
I called him up, you know, he was in the hospital a couple of days later, and I called him up, and he said to me, why doesn't this sort of thing happen to the Rolling Stones?
With his wife Olivia by his side, Harrison got through the ordeal and the subsequent trial. The intruder was found not guilty by reason of insanity, and life would go on for George Harrison. In the new millennium, he began working on another solo record. But soon there would be more bad news. In May 2001, it was revealed that Harrison was suffering from lung cancer. 2 months later, he was being treated for a brain tumor. George Harrison was gravely ill, leaving friends and former colleagues to reflect on the life of the youngest and least known Beatle of them all.
I think he'll be remembered as an immensely creative man who was not in love with his own face or his own stardom or his own ego.
People just think of George Harrison, the Beatle, as having one of the greatest careers that any musician could ever have. That's how we stay in the public mind, Beatle George.
I think George will like to be remembered as George Harrison and the special music that he did.